Now, there are videos from over 3 years ago on YouTube and on United Nations that basically explain how climate change is linked to all of the forest fires that are going on apparently. So, if you don't understand, essentially, the heating up of the earth was already foreshadowed and foretold by United Nations. They already told us that this was coming. When I was in school, they told us that by the year 2030, 2040, there would be crazy things going on. So basically, I'm going to play this video and a couple of other videos which are from United Nations. And these are videos from 2020 and even before then, which describe how certain weather patterns are going to shift the atmosphere, the climate, etc. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Welcome to Project Earth again. In this video, we'll be talking about UN Sustainable Development Goal number 13, which is all to do with raising awareness for climate change. Here's what we know. The average global temperature increased by about 0.85 degrees Celsius over the course of 1880 to 2012. Many oceans have warmed, sea level has risen, and some snow and ice layers have melted. Also, according to the UN, it is likely that by the end of this century, global temperature will be greater than 1.5 degrees Celsius, its current amount. Here's what the UN strives to do. By the year 2030, the UN would like to strengthen resistance and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters everywhere, and put climate change measures into effect in national policies, strategies, and planning. They would also like to improve education on the matter of climate change as a whole. Here are some things you can do to help. Believe it or not, making sure to save energy, food, water, resources, and the environment will actually help a great deal. You can also volunteer to work in order to help prevent further global warming. Hey, thanks for watching! Make sure to check out all the other sustainable development videos on the Earth Again channel. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in another video.
In taking action to reduce our own personal carbon footprints, to holding our elected officials accountable and pursuing climate-positive legislation, we all have a part to play as global citizens in meeting SDG 13. SDG 13, climate change, is all about preventing and mitigating the adverse effects of climate change. It's a global call to action as climate change affects every country and every person on Earth. Climate change is already disrupting national economies and affecting the livelihoods of millions, so it's paramount that action is taken today for a more sustainable tomorrow. Without action, the Earth's average global surface temperature is likely to surpass the temperature goals stated in the Paris Agreement, most negatively affecting the world's most vulnerable. Meeting this goal requires an unprecedented amount of international cooperation and requires the reconfiguration of sectors like energy, industry, transport, food, and agriculture. And while awareness of climate-positive initiatives is increasing around the world, much more must be done to integrate this momentum into national policies and strategies.
And as you can tell, all of these videos by United Nations are essentially talking about many of the things that are currently going on, because climate is linked to poverty. If there's a bad climate, then usually there's a bad poverty, and that has been demonstrated in places like the third world, where if there is a lack of resources, then basically we see that the healthcare and all of that also starts to go down too. And pretty much what scientists have learned from places like the third world is that in order to avoid poverty, you need to have a healthy environment and a healthy ecosystems. You need to have healthy resources around you. That is imperative to avoiding poverty. Once you have a once the quality of the resources around you starts to diminish, or once the quantity starts to diminish due to environmental or man-made factors, that's when you have the livelihood and then you have the poverty coming in. And then that's when everything else starts suffering too, such as economy, etc. So United Nations has essentially learned that in order to maintain a healthy economy, you need to maintain a healthy ecosystem. That is one thing these scientists have learned over the past at least 100 years, or they've at least tried to focus on that aspect of it. That's what United Nations is about, the Sustainable Development Goals. That's why these goals are all interconnected, because the interconnectedness essentially is what makes everything stick together. It's like a big puzzle, basically. If they can get all of these pieces to fit together, and if all of these pieces are good, then they can have essentially a blueprint to something that is very positive to them, which is United Nations Agenda 2030, which is global partnership essentially. And it's global partnership towards sustainable development, which is these 13 goals. I don't really understand why United Nations puts a lot of emphasis on focusing on things such as life underwater, life above waters, climate change, food security, water security, and why they put so much emphasis on these certain things. Why they feel like they need to plan 30 to 40 years ahead for these certain natural events that might occur. People cannot read between the lines about why scientists feel like they have to tell you for at least 30 years, they have to warn you for a few decades before you start to see the problems starting to occur. And this is why scientists have also started trying to develop synthetic food, or why they're trying to master developing synthetic food. Because if the sun, or basically if it gets too hot, it can disrupt the ecosystem in a way to where there could be problems producing food. Therefore, scientists would have to rely on a synthetic food source. And essentially, that's why this food is coming out around the same time that you see lots of this other stuff happening. And the number one thing that people don't understand about history is that the first ever famine that was recorded in history was a global famine. And it was the first ever one that was recorded in history. Meaning that there could potentially be another global famine that could happen, because it historically has happened before. And that's just human history. When you look at the geological extinction events that occurred multiple times, we see that essentially these are not random events, and they're not rare either, because an asteroid could disrupt the ecological food system, along with volcanic activity etc. So pretty much United Nations is all about preparing for these natural events that could disrupt the global environment, which we could already see trickling down. And it isn't only natural disasters, because you could see the evolution of microbes and bacteria to the point to where human bodies at some point will not be able to naturally fight off these things. That's why healthcare and global healthcare is another SDG for United Nations. So essentially, United Nations is preparing for, something that we can already see happening, such as the heating up of the earth. And y'all have to remember that there was a 2015 Paris Agreement that was basically signed by over 40 countries around the world. This isn't anything I'm making up. This is something that multiple countries across the world have already agreed to be a part of. It's called Global Partnership. And Global Partnership is a major aspect and is even an SDG of United Nations. So essentially every country is already part of this United Nations for the most part. And that's why the Global Partnership SDG, which is about people, prosperity, and planet, talks about leaving no one behind, because essentially United Nations is about uniting every nations of the world. That's why it's an SDG, which is about global partnership. It's a global partnership being established by every country to meet the sustainable development goals.
What is the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. This requires economic and social transformation to face the climate challenges now and moving into the future based on the best available science. The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action. By 2020, countries communicate their plans, known as nationally determined contributions. Countries communicate actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Countries also communicate actions they will take to build resilience to adapt to the impacts of rising temperatures. This may include information on adaptation and finance flows. The Paris Agreement also provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to those countries who need it. Starting in 2024, countries report transparently on actions taken. Collective progress under the Paris Agreement will be assessed through a global stocktake. This will lead to recommendations for countries to set more ambitious plans in the next round.